It's almost an unshakable belief that history is written by the victors. But what if I told you that the saga of one of the greatest Viking explorers was actually shaped by a loser? Erik the Red wasn't a king or a conqueror of kingdoms, but an outcast, an exile whose life in Iceland was taken by a series of murders. That's a counterintuitive statement, right? The story you're about to hear will show you how a man, banished from his land and forced to flee, rewrote his own destiny and, as a reward, founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland, a feat that most people overlook. Our story begins before he was a legend, before he was Erik the Red. Who was this man, and why did vengeance and blood follow him like a shadow? And, most importantly, how did he turn disgrace into an opportunity for his people? If this story has already surprised you, please like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified about the next parts of this epic journey. And if you have a story you'd like to see told, leave your suggestion in the comments. We already have a complete playlist on the Vikings waiting for you. In the frozen heart of Norway, in an era dominated by the clang of swords and the roar of longships, the tradition of blood and honor was the moral compass of a people. Erik Thorvaldsson, the Viking who would one day be known as the Red, was born in the shadow of this heritage. His father, Thorvald Osvaldsson, was not a lord of lands, but a warrior whose destiny was shaped by the same violence that would forge his son's character. 10th century Norway was a cauldron of small, constantly warring kingdoms, and alliances were as volatile as the North Sea. Loyalty was a tribal concept, and vengeance a sacred imperative. When Thorvald was banished from Jæren for a few killings, the crime was not just death, but the violation of a code of honor. This exile was not just a punishment, it was Erik's first lesson in how violence could close doors, but also open new ones. Upon leaving Norway, Thorvald and his family settled in Iceland, a land of settlers and outlaws who fled the tyranny of King Harald Finehair. Iceland, far from the direct influence of a monarch, was a society of clans where the law was negotiated in local assemblies, the Alþingi, but justice was often meted out with the blade of a sword. The land, though vast, was scarce in resources, and tensions over pastures and timber were constant. It was in this environment of wild freedom and scarcity that Erik grew up. He became a strong man, with a temper as explosive as the Hekla volcano, but with a cunning worthy of his ancestors. The sagas describe him as a man with a red head and a reddish beard, an imposing figure who did not hesitate to use force to defend his name and his possessions. History repeats itself, and Erik's destiny echoed his father's. In Iceland, rivalry over land led to a bloody confrontation. Erik, now a landowner in Haukadalr, became embroiled in a dispute with a neighbor, Eyjolf Saur. The fight escalated quickly after Erik lent him high seat pillars, an important symbol of status, which were lost or damaged. Tragedy struck when, in a fit of rage, Erik killed not only Eyjolf but also Holmgang Hrafn, one of Eyjolf's men. According to the sagas, he acted in legitimate defense of his honor and property, but for the Icelandic community, he had crossed a line. Vengeance, which was permitted, turned into a series of murders that made him an outcast. The Alþingi, the General Assembly of Iceland, judged Erik for his crimes. The decision was unanimous and irrevocable: exile. He could no longer live in the land that had welcomed him. But the story of Erik the Red would not end there. The banishment, far from being the end, was the catalyst that propelled him into the unknown. He knew that for a Viking, the only honorable way out of exile was to search for new lands, a new beginning where his strength and leadership could be used to build, and not just to destroy. The weight of his heritage, marked by exile and violence, would now become the engine of one of the greatest undertakings in Viking history. The epithet, the Red, which would become synonymous with one of the most audacious figures in Viking history, was not a title of nobility, but rather a reflection of his fiery nature. In Iceland, life was forged by the climate, disputes, and the need for survival. Erik Thorvaldsson, with his reddish hair and beard, seemed to embody the fury of fire itself, in contrast to the ice that surrounded him. His temper was known to be as impetuous as the wind that blew over the Icelandic mountains, and his determination as unshakable as the island's volcanic rocks. The sagas describe Erik as a man with red hair and beard, which earned him the nickname Rowdy in Old Norse, which means the red. But the name did not just refer to his physical appearance. It was a metaphor for his personality. Erik was a natural leader, but his leadership was tempered by a dangerous impatience. He was not a man of half measures or loose compromises. His way of resolving conflicts was direct and often lethal. Life in Iceland demanded a brutal tenacity. Settlers competed for scarce resources, and disputes over land and cattle were the spark of countless feuds. Erik, with his indomitable spirit, did not back down from provocation. He believed that honor was more valuable than life itself, and that defending his family and property was a sacred duty. This code of conduct, although aligned with Viking culture, put him on a collision course with the law. The saga details an incident that perfectly exemplifies his nature. After being expelled from Haukadalr, Erik moved to the island of Uxni. There, he fell out with a farmer named Thorgest. The dispute once again revolved around high seat pillars, the same ones that had caused Eyjolf Saur's death. Erik entrusted the pillars to Thorgest, but when he tried to get them back, Thorgest refused to return them. Instead of taking the case to the Alþingi, the local assembly, Erik gathered a group of followers and marched to Thorgest's farm. The dispute turned into a bloodbath. Erik and his men killed Thorgest and his two sons, triggering a new wave of violence. This new crime was the point of no return for Erik. Icelandic society, which strove to maintain a precarious order, could not tolerate his continuous brutality. He was judged again, and this time his fate was sealed. He was declared an outlaw for 3 years, which meant that anyone could kill him without punishment. Exile was his only option. This banishment, however, was not seen by Erik as a defeat. For him, it was an opportunity to fulfill a greater destiny. Iceland rejected him, but he refused to be destroyed by it. Instead of hiding, he decided to leave, taking with him his family and the promise of finding a new land, a promise that would lead him to become a legend. The epithet, the Red, which was once a symbol of his fury, would now become a symbol of his resilience and ambition. The verdict of the Alþingi reverberated throughout Iceland. Erik the Red was declared an outlaw, banished from his adopted land. The sentence of exile, however, did not crush his spirit. On the contrary, it ignited a spark of ambition that propelled him into the unknown. Far from being a punishment, banishment became his liberation, the chance to rewrite his destiny in virgin lands. The Viking world was vast, and for a man like Erik, who could no longer live under the laws of Iceland, the only direction to go was west, toward where the sun set. He was determined to find the land cited by Gunnbjörn Ulfsson, a Norwegian explorer who, centuries earlier, had been blown off course by a storm and sighted a new landmass west of Iceland. Gunnbjörn had named the island Gunnbjarnarskr, Gunnbjörn's Skerries, but never explored it. His account, although imprecise, became a legend whispered among Viking sailors. The land was described as mountainous, covered in ice and shrouded in fog. But for Erik, it was a promise, a refuge where he could take his family and followers and build a new home, far from the blood feuds of Iceland. He knew the journey would be dangerous, but the prospect of becoming the lord of his own destiny, instead of an outcast, was a powerful motivator. His decision was not just an act of desperation, but a strategic calculation. He was a practical man, a leader who understood the importance of land for a clan's power and survival. The preparation for the journey was methodical. Erik gathered his family, his most precious possessions, and his most loyal followers. He had a clear plan: to sail west, find the land cited by Gunnbjörn, and spend his 3 years of exile exploring it. His goal was not just to find a place to live, but also a land that could sustain a colony, with pastures for cattle and timber for construction. He was not a poet or a dreamer. He was a man of action guided by the need for survival. His search for new lands was not an adventure, but a mission of life or death. The threat of being killed in Iceland was real, and the icy sea was his only escape route. In a final act of defiance, Erik did not leave in secret. His departure was public, a declaration of intent to all who had judged him. He was going west, to the land of ice and mystery, but he would return. His banishment was temporary, and he intended to use that time to build an empire. In Erik's mind, he was not running away, he was seeking a future. Iceland, with its feuds and laws, was the past. The new land, with its promises of freedom and prosperity, was the future. He was determined to prove that his exile was, in fact, his greatest opportunity. And with that determination, he hoisted the sails of his ship and sailed into the unknown, driven by the promise of a land yet untouched by the conflicts of men. Erik's ship, a sturdy gnar built to withstand the Atlantic storms, sliced through the icy waters, leaving Iceland behind. Aboard, Erik, his family, and a few loyal sailors and explorers clung to hope. The journey was a dive into the unknown, with the compass guided only by the direction of the sun and the stars. Erik was an experienced seaman, and his navigation was a mix of ancestral wisdom, careful observation of nature, and pure audacity. He trusted his instinct, which was the only map he had. The legend of Gunnbjörn Ulfsson was his only reference, and the promise of a distant land was his only reward. The crossing was a test of physical and mental endurance. The Arctic Ocean was merciless, with icebergs lurking, treacherous currents and sudden storms that threatened to swallow the small ship. The cold was constant and the wind cutting. Life on board was a daily struggle against dehydration, hunger, and fear. However, Erik's experience as a sailor and leader was fundamental to keeping the crew united and focused. He knew that morale was as important as food and water, and he kept hope alive with stories of the promised land and the promise of a new life. After a long and dangerous journey, a white horizon appeared to the north. It was not the familiar silhouette of Iceland, but a vast and imposing landmass covered in snowy mountains and glaciers. The sight was overwhelming, a landscape of wild and brutal beauty. It was the land that Gunnbjörn had sighted, the destination Erik was looking for. They followed the coast, looking for a suitable place to land. Erik became the first European to systematically explore this unknown land, sailing along its southwestern coast. He discovered deep, green fjords, which were a visual relief after the arid, icy landscape they had seen. Erik, with the shrewdness of an explorer and the vision of a leader, noticed that the land was rich in potential resources. There were pastures for cattle in the valleys protected by the fjords, and although there were no dense forests like in Scandinavia, there were smaller trees and shrubs that could be used for fuel and construction. The land, although mostly covered in ice, had the potential to be colonized. Erik's discovery was not an accident. It was the result of his determination and his ability to read the signs of nature. He not only found a land, but studied it, assessing its potential to sustain a new community. He spent the 3 years of his exile exploring the new land, sailing along the coast, and entering the fjords. He named the land Greenland, a name that would be crucial in his future strategy. Erik's arrival in Greenland was not just a geographical discovery. It was the beginning of a new story, a journey that would transform a banished man's life into a legend, and the life of a people into an epic adventure. The discovery of the new land, with its icy mountains and deep fjords, was the first step of Erik the Red's journey into the future. However, he knew that the survival of his undertaking depended not only on geography, but on the ability to attract followers to build a new civilization. In an act of strategic genius that today we would call marketing, Erik made a decision that would change the destiny of that land. He named it Greenland, which in Old Norse means Greenland. The choice of name was no coincidence. It was a calculated move to seduce settlers from overcrowded and arid Iceland. Iceland, although it had forests and pastures, was already densely populated by the standards of the time, and disputes over land and resources were constant. Most settlers lived in precarious conditions, and the prospect of moving to a new, unknown land was daunting. Erik knew that perception was more powerful than reality. By naming the land Greenland, he was planting an image of prosperity and fertility in the minds of potential settlers. The name Greenland evoked images of fertile pastures, abundant harvests, and a milder climate, even though most of the island was covered in ice and glaciers. The truth was that the southern part of Greenland, where Erik had explored, was indeed greener during the summer, with lush valleys and pastures that could sustain cattle. He called it Greenland, the sagas say, because he thought people would be more willing to go there if the land had a good name. The phrase, simple and direct, summarizes his strategy. Erik understood that the success of his colony depended on attracting people willing to risk their lives in search of a new beginning. He needed farmers, craftsmen, and warriors to build and defend the new community. And the name Greenland was the perfect bait. It was a promise of hope and opportunity, a contrast to the reality of his own life in Iceland, marked by exile and violence. Erik's strategy worked. Upon returning to Iceland after his exile, he did not arrive as an outcast, but as an explorer who had discovered a land of opportunity. His accounts of Greenland, combined with the promise of free and fertile land, attracted the attention of discontented Icelanders. He became the catalyst for a new colonization movement, a leader who, through his vision and audacity, had transformed his own exile into an opportunity for his people. Greenland, the land that was, for the most part, a landscape of ice and rock, became, in the minds of the Icelanders, the Greenland of promise. After the period of exile, the figure of Erik the Red returned to Iceland, no longer as a banished man, but as a successful explorer. His return was a significant event. Instead of being met with hostility, curiosity and interest in his journey were evident. Iceland was overpopulated and suffering from tensions over resources, and the news of a new land, rich in potential, spread like wildfire. Erik was a charismatic storyteller, and his descriptions of Greenland, the Greenland, were vivid and appealing. He described the vast fjords, the green pastures in the protected valleys, the rivers full of salmon, and the opportunities for hunting seals and whales. He did not hide the challenges, but framed them as obstacles to be overcome by courageous men and women. Erik's narrative was a mix of fact and persuasion. He instinctively used psychology to sell the idea of a new life in Greenland. He knew that what would most attract Icelanders were the promises of free land and a new beginning. In a time of crisis in Iceland, his story was a ray of hope. He did not just talk about the land, he presented it as a solution to the problems of the Icelanders. He promised his followers that they would no longer be forced to fight for pastures or live under the threat of exile. Greenland would be their land, where they could build their own farms and communities, far from the blood feuds. The power of his narrative lay in his ability to transform the unknown into a promise. He was not just recruiting settlers, he was offering a dream. He convinced families to sell their lands and their goods in Iceland, to embark on a dangerous journey, and to venture into the icy sea in search of a new life. His charisma and leadership were so strong that he managed to convince not just single men and adventurers, but entire families, with women and children. Erik's story was that of a man who turned his own misfortune into an opportunity for his people. Erik's plan was methodical and ambitious. He intended to lead a fleet of ships to Greenland, with the intention of founding a permanent colony. He knew that the first voyage would be the most important, as its success would determine the future of the colony. He was not just sailing into the unknown, he was building a civilization. His return to Iceland was one of the most important moments of his life, because it was there that he transformed his vision into a reality. The promise of the Greenland resonated with the Icelanders, and his return marked the beginning of one of the greatest migrations of the Viking Age. The success of Erik's return to Iceland was immediate and overwhelming. The call for the colonization of the Greenland resonated with more than 300 people. The prospect of a new life on free lands was a powerful incentive, and the promise of Erik the Red's leadership was the guarantee that the undertaking would have a purpose. The preparation for the expedition became a frenzy of activity. The fleet, made up of 25 ships, was meticulously organized. Although the sagas mention the presence of drakars, warships, most of the fleet was made up of nars, robust and wide cargo ships, built to transport goods, cattle, and people across the ocean. These ships were the backbone of the expedition, designed to withstand the hostile conditions of the North Atlantic. The collection of supplies was a monumental task. Families sold their properties in Iceland to buy the essentials for the new life: seeds for planting, iron tools, weapons, non-perishable foods like dried fish and salted meat, and most importantly, cattle. Erik knew that the survival of the colony depended on its ability to sustain itself. The cows, sheep, goats, and horses were the basis of the agrarian economy he planned to establish. and the transport of these animals required strong and stable ships. The cargo of each nar was carefully balanced to ensure the safety of the crossing, and the organization of the expedition was a reflection of Erik's leadership. He left nothing to chance. The expedition was not just a migration, but the transfer of a civilization. The families took with them their traditions, their beliefs, and their knowledge. They were courageous men and women, willing to abandon what they knew to venture into the unknown. Viking society was patriarchal, but the participation of women in the colonization was crucial. They were responsible for organizing domestic life, caring for the health and education of children, and in many cases, working alongside men in agriculture and livestock. Without them, the colony would have no future. Erik's expedition became a symbol of hope and resilience. The sagas tell that one of the ships, commanded by Thorstein, Erik's son, was blown off course by a storm and ended up reaching Newfoundland in Canada, which is one of the first indications of Viking contact with the American continent. The initial plan was simple, but the challenges of nature were unpredictable. The preparation for the journey was a demonstration of faith in Erik's leadership. The families entrusted their lives to him and his vision, and the expedition became one of the most important moments in Viking history, an event that would forever change the geography of the North Atlantic. Sometime around the year 985, the fleet of 25 ships of Erik the Red hoisted their sails and departed from Iceland, heading west, toward the land he had named Greenland. The journey, which would last for weeks, was one of the most dangerous in the history of Viking navigation. The cold, merciless North Atlantic was a constant enemy, and the settlers, most of them inexperienced in long ocean crossings, faced an ordeal of challenges. The title, Journey of Hope, was a paradox, because hope was what kept them alive, but uncertainty was what haunted them. The fleet sailed together for a few days, but soon the weather turned. Fierce storms and dense fog separated the ships, turning the journey into an individual nightmare for each vessel. The biting, constant, and cruel cold was one of the biggest challenges. The families, huddled together in the nars, struggled to stay warm, sharing blankets and body heat. The sea spray froze on the sails and decks, making navigation even more dangerous. The threat of icebergs, giants of ice that broke off from the northern glaciers, was a constant. The sailors had to be always on alert, dodging the mountains of ice that could crush their ships in seconds. Uncertainty was the greatest torment. No one except Erik knew what awaited them at the end of the journey. The legend of Gunnbjörn Ulfsson was a vague story, and the promise of a Greenland could be just a sailor's tale. With each passing day, the anxiety increased. The supply of water and food was limited, and discipline was crucial to ensure that the food lasted until the destination. The fight against hunger and dehydration was as important as the fight against the cold and storms. Only 14 of the 25 original ships managed to reach Greenland. 8 ships were lost at sea, swallowed by the waves or crushed by icebergs. 3 ships were forced to return to Iceland, with their morale crushed and their hope lost. The sagas do not detail the tragedy of these ships, but we can imagine the despair and pain of those who died at sea, and the relief of those who managed to return home. The journey of Erik the Red was an epic of survival. The 14 ships that arrived in Greenland were living proof of the resilience and courage of the settlers, and the success of the undertaking became a symbol of their determination to build a new home, even if it cost the lives of many. The journey of hope, despite its losses, was the journey that gave life to a new civilization in the North Atlantic. The arrival of the 14 remaining ships on the southwest coast of Greenland was a moment of euphoria and relief. After an infernal journey, the settlers finally set foot on solid ground. Erik the Red guided them to the fjord he had named Eiriksfjord. The landscape, although still dominated by ice, revealed protected valleys and green pastures that were the basis for the promise of a new life. The place chosen by Erik for the first major colony was the area now known as Brattahlid, which means steep slope. The name was appropriate because the land, although promising, required effort and determination to be tamed. Erik, with the authority of a leader and the vision of a founder, distributed the lands among the settlers. He not only gave them the land, but also the responsibility of building a new society. Brattahlid became the center of the new colony, the capital of a new kingdom. Erik's farm, the largest and most important in the region, was built with timber brought from Iceland and with local turf and stones. The construction of the houses, barns, and stables was an arduous task, but the spirit of community was strong. Everyone worked together, helping each other build their new lives. The founding of Brattahlid was not just the construction of a settlement, it was the creation of a new society. The settlers brought with them their laws and traditions from Iceland, and the colony was organized autonomously, without the influence of a monarch. Erik became the natural leader of the community, the landnamamadur, man who takes land. His leadership was not based on a title of nobility, but on his charisma, his experience, and his audacity. He was a leader who had guided his people through the storm and the unknown. The arrival of the settlers in Greenland marked the beginning of a new era. They were not just settlers, they were pioneers. They would have to learn to survive in an environment that, although promising, was unforgiving. Agriculture would be difficult, but possible. Hunting and fishing would be essential for survival. And above all, they would have to build a united community to face the challenges that would come. The founding of Brattahlid was the first step of an epic journey. The story of how a group of Vikings, led by an exiled man, built a new civilization in one of the most remote parts of the world. In the heart of Eriksfjord, with its steep slopes and green valleys, the founding of Brattahlid became the symbol of the new Viking civilization in Greenland. The place chosen by Erik the Red was a strategic point, with access to the sea and pastures that could sustain the life of the colony. The first major construction was Erik's farm, which became the political and social center of the community. The farm of Brattahlid was not just a residence, but a complex of buildings that included Erik's house, barns, stables, and a large communal hall where the settlers gathered to make decisions, celebrate festivals, and tell stories. Erik, as the leader of the colony, settled in Brattahlid, and from there he governed his new land. His leadership was based on his reputation as a warrior and explorer, but also on his ability to organize the community and make difficult decisions. He was a leader who did not fear hard work and participated actively in the construction of the houses and buildings. His leadership was not that of a king, but of a patriarch, a father to his people. His authority came from his charisma and his success. The founding of Brattahlid was an act of faith and audacity. The Vikings built their houses with the materials they had on hand, using turf, stone, and wood. The architecture was an adaptation of Viking architecture from Iceland and Norway, with turf walls that protected against the cold and wooden roofs that supported the weight of the snow. The houses were modest but efficient. Life in Greenland demanded a brutal tenacity, and the constructions reflected this reality. The most important thing about the founding of Brattahlid was the creation of a center of power and identity. Erik's farm became the point of reference for all the settlers. It was the place where decisions were made, where the law was applied, and where the community felt safe. The founding of Brattahlid was the moment when Erik's vision became a reality. He not only discovered a land, but transformed it into a home for his people. If you enjoyed how this story is unfolding, please leave a like to help us continue spreading knowledge. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next parts of this epic saga. If you have an incredible story you'd like to see told, leave your suggestion in the comments. Also, tell us where you're watching from. Your participation is our greatest reward. Life in Brattahlid and the neighboring settlements was not a fairy tale. The daily life of the Viking settlers in Greenland was a constant struggle against a hostile and unforgiving environment. The climate, although milder than Erik had expected, was still brutal. The winters were long and dark, and temperatures dropped to extreme levels. Survival depended on the settlers' ability to adapt and work together. Agriculture, although possible, was a challenge. The sagas tell that the Vikings cultivated cereals like barley, but the harvests were small, and the growing season was short. Livestock was the basis of the agrarian economy. The settlers raised sheep, goats, and cows, which were adapted to the cold climate. The meat and milk of these animals were the main source of protein and energy for the settlers, and the wool of the sheep was used to make warm and resistant clothes. Life in Greenland was a battle against scarcity. Wood, a vital resource for building houses and ships, was scarce. The settlers had to import wood from Iceland and Norway, which made the construction of buildings and ships a luxury. Turf and stone were the main building materials, and the houses, although modest, were efficient and protected against the cold. Hunting and fishing were essential for survival. The settlers hunted seals, whales, and polar bears, and fished for salmon and cod. The meat of seals and whales was an important source of protein and fat, and seal oil was used as fuel for lamps. The hunting of polar bears was dangerous, but the animal's skin was valuable, and the ivory from walrus tusks was one of the main exports of the colony. Daily life was dominated by tasks of survival. The men spent their days hunting, fishing, and working on the farms. The women were responsible for taking care of the houses, preparing food, spinning wool, and making clothes. The children helped their parents with the tasks and learned the skills necessary to survive in Greenland. Life was hard, but the community was united. They helped each other, sharing work and food. Solidarity was the only way to survive in such a hostile environment. Erik the Red's colony was an example of how determination and collaboration could overcome the most difficult challenges. With the Brattahlid colony established, the vision of Erik the Red began to expand. He did not just want a large farm. He wanted a civilization. The population of the colony grew rapidly with the arrival of new ships from Iceland, and the need for more land became evident. Erik, with the authority of a leader, divided the lands of Greenland among the settlers, creating two large settlements: the eastern settlement, Eystrabygd, and the western settlement, Vestrabygd. Brattahlid became the center of the eastern settlement, the most populous and developed part of the colony. The division of lands was not an act of selfishness, but a strategy to ensure the survival of the colony. Erik knew that the dispersion of the settlements would allow the settlers to explore a larger area and have access to more resources. The western settlement, located further north, was an area for hunting and fishing with fewer pastures, but with an abundance of seals, walruses, and whales. The eastern settlement, further south, was the agricultural area of the colony, with more fertile pastures and a longer growing season. Erik's strategy was to create a diversified economy, with the two settlements complementing each other. The expansion of the settlements was a gradual process. The settlers moved to new areas, building their houses and farms. They took with them their families, their animals, and their hopes. Communication between the two settlements was difficult, especially during the winter, but the settlers remained united through local assemblies, the Things, where they gathered to resolve disputes, make laws, and make important decisions for the community. The Viking society of Greenland was an agrarian republic where authority was based on strength and reputation, but the law was applied through a system of local assemblies. The expansion of the settlements was a testament to the success of Erik the Red's vision. The colony, which started with 14 ships, became a prosperous and growing civilization. Erik's settlements became one of the largest and longest-lasting Viking colonies, with a population that reached about 5,000 people. The story of the expansion of the settlements is the story of how determination, vision, and collaboration can transform a group of settlers into a people. The arrival of the Vikings in Greenland was not the first time the island had been inhabited. Long before Erik the Red and his settlers, Greenland was home to indigenous peoples, the Dorset, a group of hunters and fishermen who lived in the Arctic. The contact between the Vikings and the Dorset is one of the most mysterious and least documented aspects of Greenland's history. The sagas, although rich in details about the life of the settlers, do not provide clear information about the first encounters with the natives. The Vikings referred to them as skrælings, a term that can be translated as strangers or barbarians, and which was used to describe all the non-Viking peoples they encountered, including the natives of North America. The sagas report that, initially, the encounters between the Vikings and the Dorset were peaceful. The natives, who lived in igloos and hunted with bows and arrows, were a source of curiosity for the settlers. The Vikings, in turn, were a source of fascination for the natives, who had never seen ships and iron weapons. However, the nature of these encounters is a mystery. There are no records of trade or significant social interactions. It is possible that the Dorset, who lived mainly in the northernmost areas of Greenland, simply avoided the Vikings, who settled in the southernmost areas. The sagas, however, give indications that the encounters were not always peaceful. Violence was a part of Viking culture, and confrontations with the natives were inevitable. The sagas tell that in one of the expeditions of Thorvald, Erik's son, to North America, he was killed in a confrontation with the Skrælings. It is likely that similar events occurred in Greenland. Archaeological evidence, although scarce, shows that Viking settlements and Dorset settlements existed in Greenland at the same time. However, there are no signs that the two peoples lived together or that they interacted socially. The mystery surrounding the nature of the encounters between the Vikings and the Dorset is one of the greatest enigmas in Greenland's history. The sagas, which were written centuries after the events, may have exaggerated the violence or omitted important details. The only thing we know for sure is that the two peoples existed in Greenland for a time, but the lack of evidence of interaction suggests that they maintained a distance from each other. The fate of the Dorset is another mystery. They disappeared from Greenland around the 14th century, long before the disappearance of the Vikings, and the reason for their disappearance is still unknown. The history of relations with the natives in Greenland is a story of silence and mystery. The survival of Erik the Red's colony in Greenland depended on its ability to connect with the outside world. The island, although rich in hunting and fishing resources, was deficient in essential goods like iron, wood, and cereals. The solution to this problem was the establishment of trade routes with Iceland and Norway, which became the lifeline of the colony. Trade was not just a way to obtain supplies, it was a way to maintain cultural identity and connection with the homeland. The cargo ships, the Nars, made the dangerous journey across the North Atlantic, loaded with goods that were the sustenance of the colony. The main export products of Greenland were walrus ivory, polar bear skins, seal skins, and gyrfalcons. Walrus ivory, in particular, was a luxury product highly valued in Europe, used to make chess pieces, art objects, and jewelry. Norway, which controlled the trade route with Greenland, had a monopoly on the export of ivory, which became an important source of income for the kingdom. The gyrfalcon, a rare and valuable bird of prey, was a gift from nobles to other nobles, and the falconers of Greenland were famous for their skill in capturing them. In exchange for their products, the settlers received essential goods from Iceland and Norway. Iron was the most important, used to make agricultural tools, weapons, and ships. Wood was used for building houses and ships. Salt was used to preserve food, and wine, barley, and honey were luxury goods that enriched the lives of the settlers. Trade, although dangerous, was the backbone of the colony's economy. The ships, with their colorful sails and high stems, were a symbol of hope and connection to the world. Erik the Red's colony became an outpost of the Viking Empire, a trading center in the middle of the North Atlantic. The history of trade in Greenland is the story of how resilience and ingenuity can overcome the most difficult challenges. The settlers not only survived, they prospered, building a civilization that would last for centuries. The history of trade is the story of how the colonization of Greenland was not just an adventure, but an economic enterprise. Erik the Red was not just an explorer and a leader, he was a visionary. His vision of a prosperous future for the Vikings in Greenland, even with the difficulties, was what differentiated him from other Vikings who only sought wealth and glory. He did not see Greenland as a land of exile, but as a land of opportunity. He believed that the colony could become a self-sufficient and prosperous civilization, a beacon of hope in the middle of the North Atlantic. His vision was not just for himself, but for his people, for the future generations who would live in Greenland. Erik's leadership was based on his ability to inspire and motivate people. He was a leader who did not fear hard work and participated actively in the life of the colony. He was a man of action who made difficult decisions and took responsibility for them. He knew that the colony could only survive if everyone worked together, and he encouraged collaboration and solidarity among the settlers. He was a leader who cared about the well-being of his people, and his concern was that of a father for his children. Erik's vision was that of an agrarian society, where agriculture and livestock would be the basis of the economy. He knew that Greenland could not be sustained only by hunting and fishing, and he encouraged the settlers to cultivate the land and raise cattle. He also believed in the power of trade, and he established trade routes with Iceland and Norway to obtain the essential goods that the colony needed. Erik's vision was not utopian, It was realistic and pragmatic. Erik the Red's colony prospered for centuries. It became an important trading center and an outpost of the Viking Empire. Erik's vision became the reality of a people. The history of the colonization of Greenland is the story of a man who turned his own tragedy into an opportunity for his people, and of how his vision became the basis of a civilization that would last for centuries. His leadership and his vision are a testament to how determination and audacity can change the course of history. The arrival of Christianity in Greenland marked a turning point in the history of the colony and in the life of Erik the Red. Christianity, which was spreading rapidly through Scandinavia, arrived in Greenland through Erik's son, Leif Erikson. Leif's story is one of the most fascinating in the sagas. At the command of the King of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, he went to Norway, where he converted to Christianity and was tasked with taking the new faith to Greenland. Leif's mission, however, put him on a collision course with his father. Erik the Red was a devotee of the Old Norse religion, a believer in the Asgardian gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. For him, the pagan religion was the basis of his cultural identity and the source of his strength. The introduction of a new religion, which denied the gods of his ancestors, was a threat to his way of life. The conflict between father and son was not just a religious dispute. It was a conflict of generations, a clash between tradition and modernity. Erik, a pagan and traditional leader, saw the new faith as a threat to his authority and his culture. Leif, a young Christian and visionary, saw the new faith as the future of the colony. The sagas report that initially Erik refused to convert. He clung to his faith, and his farm in Brattahlid became a bastion of the old religion. Leif, in turn, became a fervent evangelist. He built a church in Brattahlid, which became the center of the new faith. The sagas say that Erik's wife, Theodhild, converted to Christianity, but that Erik remained a pagan until his death. The conflict between the old and the new was evident, and the colony was divided. Christianity, however, eventually prevailed. The new faith, with its promises of salvation and its system of values, became more attractive to the settlers than the old pagan religion. Erik the Red's colony became a Christian society, and Leif's church became the center of religious life. The story of the arrival of Christianity in Greenland is the story of how a new faith can change the culture and destiny of a people. The story of the conflict between Erik and Leif is a testament to how change can be painful, and how the love between a father and a son can overcome religious differences. Life in Greenland, with its difficulties and challenges, was a constant test of resilience. But for the Vikings, who were explorers and adventurers by nature, the unknown always held a fascination. The dream of new lands, which had driven Erik the Red to find Greenland, was rekindled with the account of a new explorer, Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni's story is one of the most important in the sagas, as he was the one who accidentally sighted what would later be called Vinland, North America. Bjarni, an Icelandic merchant who was on his way to Greenland to visit his father, was blown off course by a storm. He sailed for days, lost at sea, until he sighted a land that was not Greenland. He saw 3 different lands, one mountainous and covered in ice, probably Baffin Island, one with dense forests, probably Labrador in Canada, and one with wild vines and abundant timber, probably Newfoundland in Canada. Bjarni, however, did not land. He was anxious to find his father, and ignoring the curiosity of his crew, he sailed toward Greenland. Bjarni's account, although ignored by him, sparked great interest in Erik the Red's colony. The settlers, who depended on importing wood from Iceland and Norway, saw in the land with forests the promise of a vital resource. Erik the Red, who was aging and becoming more dependent on his son Leif, saw in Bjarni's story the opportunity for a new exploration. The dream of Vinland became the new goal of the colony, the promise of a more prosperous future. Erik, who had turned his own misfortune into an opportunity for his people, now saw in Bjarni's story a new opportunity for his family. Bjarni's account was not just a curiosity, it was the trigger that propelled the next generation of Viking explorers. The story of Vinland, the land of vines, became a legend, a beacon of hope that drove them to sail west, into the unknown. Erik the Red's ambition to explore new lands now became the ambition of his son, Leif Erikson. The story of the Dream of Vinland is the story of how an explorer's account, ignored by him, became the inspiration for one of the greatest undertakings in Viking history. The Dream of Vinland became a reality through the audacity of Leif Erikson, the son of Erik the Red. Leif, who had already ventured to Norway where he converted to Christianity, was a natural leader and an experienced sailor. He bought Bjarni Herjolfsson's ship and, with a crew of 25 men, set off for the west in search of the land that Bjarni had sighted. Leif's expedition, however, was not just an adventure. It was a mission. He wanted to find a land that could sustain the Greenland colony, and he was determined to succeed. Leif's journey to Vinland is one of the most important events in the history of European exploration. The sagas detail Leif's journey, his arrival at a land of ice-covered mountains, Helluland, today Baffin Island, his arrival at a land with dense forests and white sands, Markland, today Labrador in Canada, and finally, his arrival at a land he called Vinland, the land of vines because of the wild vines he and his crew found. The exact location of Vinland is still a mystery, but most historians believe that it is on the island of Newfoundland, in Canada, at the site of a Viking settlement discovered by archaeologists at L'Anse aux Meadows. Leif and his crew built a small colony in Vinland, Leifsbudir, and spent the winter there. The land was rich in resources, with abundant salmon in the rivers and forests of wood that could be used for construction. They also found wild vines, which was a pleasant surprise. Leif's expedition was a success, but his stay in Vinland was short. The reason for his return to Greenland is still a mystery. Some historians believe that his mission was only for exploration, while others believe that his intention was to colonize the land. The lack of colonization in Vinland may have been due to a lack of resources, the hostility of the natives, the Skrælings, or internal conflicts among the settlers. Leif Erikson's expedition was a landmark in the history of exploration. He was the first European to set foot on the American continent, and his discovery became a legend that would be told and retold for centuries. Leif's story is the story of a son who followed in his father's footsteps, an explorer who turned a legend into a reality. The discovery of Vinland was one of the greatest feats of the Viking Age, a testament to the audacity and ingenuity of a people who did not fear the unknown. Life in Greenland, with its challenges and difficulties, was the scene of a conflict of generations between father and son, between the old and the new. Erik the Red was a pagan and traditional leader, a man who lived according to the ancient laws and traditions of his ancestors. He believed in strength, honor, and vengeance, the pillars of Viking culture. Leif Erikson, his son, was a Christian and visionary leader, a man who believed in peace, love, and mercy. He saw the future of the colony in the new faith and in new lands. The tension between the two was palpable, and, in many ways, it was the tension between two eras. The conflict between father and son was not just religious, it was philosophical. Erik believed that a leader's strength was measured by his ability to defend his people and his honor. Leif believed that a leader's strength was measured by his ability to inspire his people and guide them toward a better future. Erik saw his authority as a birthright, a heritage from his ancestors. Leif saw his authority as a responsibility, a duty to guide his people into the future. The sagas report that Erik refused to convert to Christianity, even with the insistence of Leif and his own wife, Theodold. He clung to his faith, his tradition, and his identity. He saw the new faith as a threat to his authority and his culture, and he refused to submit to it. He, the man who had defied the law and exile, now refused to submit to a new religion. His refusal was an act of defiance, a last gasp of a dying era. The conflict of generations, however, was resolved by diplomacy. Leif, with the wisdom of a leader, did not force his father to convert. He allowed Erik to keep his faith, while he built a new church in Brattahlid, which became the center of the new faith. The coexistence of paganism and Christianity in Greenland was a symbol of how the love between a father and a son could overcome the deepest differences. The story of the conflict between Erik and Leif is a testament to how change can be painful, but also how acceptance and respect can build bridges between generations. The story of Erik the Red and his audacious undertaking in Greenland came to us through the Icelandic sagas. The main source of information is the Saga of Erik the Red, Eirik's Saga Rauda, written centuries after the events. The sagas, which were epic narratives about the lives of Viking kings, heroes, and settlers, were the main way of preserving the memory and cultural identity of the Icelandic people. They were not historical documents in the modern sense of the word, but rather a mix of historical facts, legends, myths, and oral traditions. Their influence on how Erik's story was transmitted is incalculable. The sagas, with their poetic language and grandiose tone, transformed an explorer into a hero and a colonization into an epic. They did not just describe the events, they interpreted them, embellished them, and used them to teach moral and cultural lessons. The figure of Erik the Red was elevated to a level of heroism that he may never have had in life. His fury, his audacity, and his determination were glorified, and his acts of violence were justified by the need for vengeance and the defense of honor. The sagas transformed him into a symbol of the resilience and audacity of the Viking people. The sagas were also the source of information about life in Greenland, about the colonization, about relations with the natives, and about the dream of Vinland. They described the life of the settlers in vivid detail, the struggle against the cold and scarcity, the importance of trade, and the arrival of Christianity. However, the sagas are also a source of mystery. They do not provide precise information about dates, place names, and navigation routes. The lack of archaeological evidence for some of the events described in the sagas, such as Thorvald's death in North America, raises doubts about their historical accuracy. The influence of the sagas is evident in how the story of Erik the Red is told to this day. They are the main source of our understanding of the lives of the Vikings in Greenland, and their influence on popular culture, literature, and cinema is undeniable. The story of Erik the Red is the story of how a narrative can shape the memory of a people. The story of the sagas is the story of how the memory of a people can become the basis of its cultural identity. The legacy of Erik the Red was not limited to the founding of the Greenland colony. It extended to his sons, Leif and Thorvald, who inherited their father's audacity and spirit of exploration. Erik, despite being a man of an impetuous temper and traditional beliefs, was a leader who inspired. His sons grew up in an environment of exploration and adventure, and they became, like their father, men of action and vision. Erik's legacy was his ability to inspire his children to seek new frontiers. Leif Erikson, Erik's most famous son, was the main heir to his legacy. He not only followed in his father's footsteps, sailing west, but also surpassed him, discovering Vinland, North America. Leif's expedition to Vinland was proof that Erik's influence was not limited to Greenland. Leif was an explorer who turned a legend into a reality. His audacity and determination were a reflection of his father's spirit. Leif, however, was also an innovator. He converted to Christianity, introduced the new faith to Greenland, and built a church which put him in conflict with his father. Erik's legacy in life was not just to follow in his footsteps, but to create his own. Thorvald, Erik's other son, was also an audacious explorer. After his brother Leif's death, he set off for Vinland on a colonization expedition. He, like his father, was a man of action and courage. He became involved in conflicts with the natives and was killed in one of these confrontations. His death, although tragic, is a testament to his courage and determination. The story of Thorvald is the story of a son who tried to follow in his father's footsteps, but who was consumed by his own destiny. The legacy of Erik the Red was his ability to inspire his children to be explorers, not to fear the unknown, and to seek new frontiers. He, the man who had been banished from his land, became the father of a new generation of explorers, who would change the history of navigation and European exploration. A father's legacy is his ability to inspire his children to be better than he was, and Erik the Red was, in that sense, a successful father. Erik the Red's colony in Greenland was not an ephemeral undertaking. It persisted for almost 500 years, becoming one of the longest and most enduring Viking colonies. The growth and consolidation of the settlement in Greenland were a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the settlers, who adapted to a hostile environment and built a prosperous civilization. The colony, which started with 14 ships, came to have a population of about 5,000 people, with about 300 farms, 17 churches, and a cathedral. Erik's colony became a strategic point in the North Atlantic. The prosperity of the colony depended on its ability to sustain itself and connect with the outside world. Agriculture and livestock were the basis of the economy, but hunting and fishing were essential for survival. The colony became an important trading center, exporting walrus ivory, polar bear skins, and seal skins, and importing iron, wood, and cereals. Trade with Iceland and Norway was the lifeline of the colony, and the ships that made the dangerous journey across the North Atlantic were a symbol of its persistence. Erik the Red's colony also became a religious center. The introduction of Christianity by Leif Erikson resulted in the construction of churches and a cathedral, which became the seat of a bishopric. The Church of Greenland was subordinate to the Archdiocese of Lund in Denmark, and later to the Archdiocese of Nidaros in Norway. The presence of the church in Greenland is a testament to how the colony integrated into Christian Europe. The persistence of Erik the Red's colony was a remarkable feat. The history of the colony is the story of a people who, with determination and courage, built a civilization in one of the most remote parts of the world. Its persistence is a symbol of human resilience and how the will to live and prosper can overcome the most difficult challenges. The history of the Greenland colony is a story of survival, success, and resilience. The future generations of Vikings in Greenland inherited the legacy of Erik the Red, but also inherited the challenges of a hostile environment and a dependent economy. Erik's people prospered for centuries, but their fate was sealed by climate change and political change in Europe. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 13th century, caused a decline in temperatures, which made agriculture and livestock more difficult. The sea ice increased, which made navigation more dangerous and trade with Europe more difficult. The lifeline of the colony, trade, began to weaken, and the colony began to suffer from a shortage of essential goods like iron and wood. The political change in Norway also had an impact on the fate of Erik's people. Norway, which controlled the trade route with Greenland, became part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Norway's interest in the colony began to decline. The lack of ships and trade with Europe caused the colony to become isolated and abandoned. The sagas and historical documents give indications that the last ships to Greenland were sent in the 15th century, and the colony began to decline. The population decreased, and the farms and churches were abandoned. Archaeology, which is the main source of information about the last years of the colony, reveals that the Greenland Vikings, in their last years, adapted to climate change. They became more dependent on hunting seals and other marine animals. They also became more isolated, and their culture began to mix with the culture of the Inuit, the new indigenous peoples who arrived in Greenland in the 13th century. The lack of contact with Europe caused the settlers to lose their cultural identity and their connection with the homeland. The fate of Erik the Red's people is one of the greatest mysteries in history. The sagas do not provide a conclusion to the story of the colony. The last record of contact with the colony is from an Icelandic ship that, in 1408, found a colony in decline. What happened to the last settlers is a mystery. They may have been killed by disease, by famine, by attacks from Inuit, or they may have assimilated into Inuit culture. The fate of Erik's people is a reminder of how climate, politics, and economy can change the course of history. Erik the Red's colony in Greenland marked an era of change for the Vikings. The traditional lifestyle based on hunting, war, and plunder was replaced by a lifestyle of farmers and merchants. The transition was not easy, but it was necessary for the survival of the colony. Erik the Red, who was a warrior and an explorer, became a farmer and a community leader. He and his settlers adapted to a hostile environment and built a society that valued peace, hard work, and collaboration. The farmer's lifestyle in Greenland was dominated by agriculture and livestock. The settlers cultivated the land and raised cattle, which was the basis of their economy. The work was arduous, and the growing season was short, but the reward was survival. The merchant's life was dominated by the trade of luxury products, such as walrus ivory and polar bear skins. Trade with Iceland and Norway was the lifeline of the colony, and the merchants were the heroes of the community. They risked their lives in small ships to bring the essential goods that the colony needed. The transition from the Viking lifestyle to a lifestyle of farmers and merchants is one of the most fascinating aspects of Greenland's history. It shows how a people can adapt and reinvent themselves to survive. The story of Erik's colony is the story of how peace and trade can be as important as war and plunder. Erik the Red's colony became an example of how determination and ingenuity can build a new civilization in a hostile environment. The story of the era of change is the story of how a leader's vision can transform the culture and destiny of a people. The colonization of Greenland by Erik the Red was one of the last and most important movements of Viking expansion. The impact on world history, although often ignored, is significant. The colonization of Greenland was not just the creation of a new colony. It was the expansion of the known world, the discovery of a new land, and the connection of the North Atlantic with Europe. The colonization of Greenland paved the way for the discovery of North America by Leif Erikson, which is one of the greatest feats in the history of exploration. The Greenland colony became an important trading center in the North Atlantic. The walrus ivory and polar bear skins that were exported to Europe were highly valued luxury goods, and trade with Greenland became an important source of income for Norway. The colony also became a religious center, with the creation of a bishopric and the construction of a cathedral. The presence of the church in Greenland is a testament to how the colony integrated into Christian Europe. The impact of the colonization of Greenland on world history is a reminder of how the audacity and ingenuity of a people can change the course of history. The colonization of Greenland is the story of how a group of Vikings, led by an exiled man, built a new civilization in one of the most remote parts of the world. The history of the colonization of Greenland is one of the most important and fascinating chapters in the history of European exploration. The legacy of Erik the Red is his ability to have an impact on world history, even if his colony disappeared. The end of Erik the Red's colony in Greenland is one of the greatest mysteries in history. The colony, which prospered for almost 500 years, simply disappeared. The eventual decline and disappearance of the Viking settlements in Greenland left an enigma that has fascinated historians and archaeologists for centuries. The lack of written records and archaeological evidence about the last years of the colony makes its history a mixture of facts and speculation. The most accepted theory about the disappearance of the settlers is that the combination of several factors, such as climate change, isolation, resource scarcity, and political change in Europe, was the cause of its decline. The arrival of the Little Ice Age made agriculture and livestock more difficult, and the lack of contact with Europe caused the colony to become isolated and abandoned. The scarcity of iron and wood, which were imported from Europe, made the colony dependent on hunting and fishing. The lack of evidence of violence and massacres suggests that the settlers were not killed by attacks from Inuit, the new indigenous peoples who arrived in Greenland in the 13th century. It is more likely that they were victims of disease, famine, and despair. Archaeology reveals that in the last years of the colony, the settlers adapted to climate change and became more dependent on hunting seals and other marine animals. They also became more isolated, and their culture began to mix with the culture of the Inuit. What happened to the last settlers is a mystery. They may have died of starvation or disease, or they may have assimilated into Inuit culture. There is no evidence that they returned to Iceland or Norway. The disappearance of the Viking settlers of Greenland is a reminder of how cruel nature can be, and how the lack of contact with the outside world can have an impact on the fate of a people. The story of the disappeared settlers is the story of how a great civilization can simply disappear, leaving behind only ruins and mysteries. The end of the life of Erik the Red marked the end of an era of exploration and visionary leadership. Erik, who had turned his own exile into an opportunity for his people, died around 1003 from an epidemic that spread through the colony. The sagas do not give details about his death, but his life, which was marked by violence, audacity, and determination, had a lasting impact on the history of European exploration and colonization. His death was a moment of mourning for the colony, which lost its leader, its founder, and its patriarch. The legacy of Erik the Red was not just the founding of the Greenland colony. His legacy was his ability to inspire his people, to transform a group of settlers into a civilization, and to have an impact on world history. His leadership was based on his reputation as a warrior and explorer, but also on his ability to organize the community and make difficult decisions. He was a leader who cared about the well-being of his people, and his concern was that of a father for his children. The death of Erik the Red was a reminder that life, even for the strongest, has an end. But his legacy, the Greenland colony, survived him for centuries. His story is the story of how the audacity and ingenuity of a man can change the course of history. His death was the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the memory of a people who, with their determination, built a civilization in one of the most remote parts of the world. The end of an era is the story of how the death of a man can be the beginning of a legend. Life in Greenland was a constant struggle against nature, and the wildlife of the place was a source of food and danger. The fauna and flora of Greenland were a mix of Arctic and Scandinavian species. The flora, although scarce, included smaller trees and shrubs that could be used for fuel and construction. The fauna, however, was the main source of sustenance for the settlers. The hunting of polar bears, whales, and seals was an essential but also dangerous activity. Polar bears, which were feared and respected by the settlers, were a source of skin and meat. The hunting of polar bears was a dangerous activity that required courage and skill. The polar bear's skin was a luxury product highly valued in Europe, and its trade became an important source of income for the colony. Whales, which were hunted in fjords and shallow waters, were a source of meat, fat, and bone. Whale oil was used as fuel for lamps, and the bone was used to make tools and weapons. Seals, which were hunted in large numbers, were a source of meat, skin, and fat. The wildlife of Greenland was a source of life and death for the settlers. Hunting was the basis of their economy, but nature was unpredictable. The settlers had to be cautious, and they had to respect the animals that sustained them. The wildlife of Greenland is a symbol of the resilience of the settlers and their ability to adapt to a hostile environment. The story of wildlife is the story of how nature can be a source of life and danger, and how human ingenuity can overcome the most difficult challenges. Viking architecture in Greenland was a reflection of the need to adapt to an extreme climate. The constructions of turf, wood, and stone were the only way to survive the cold and wind of Greenland. The lack of wood, which was imported from Iceland and Norway, forced the settlers to use local materials for the construction of their houses and buildings. Turf, which was an abundant and resistant building material, was the basis of Viking architecture in Greenland. The turf houses, which were built with turf walls and wooden roofs, were efficient and protected against the cold. The turf walls, which were thick, kept the heat inside the houses, and the wooden roofs, which were covered with turf, protected against rain and snow. The houses were modest but efficient, and were designed to maximize heat and light. The windows, which were small, were made with animal skin or ice plates, and the fireplaces, which were the only source of heat, were the center of family life. Viking architecture in Greenland was a reflection of the ingenuity and resilience of the settlers. They adapted to a hostile environment and built a civilization that was functional and sustainable. Viking architecture is a testament to how necessity can be the mother of invention, and how human ingenuity can overcome the most difficult challenges. The history of Viking architecture in Greenland is the story of how a people can build a civilization in an environment that seems impossible to inhabit. The colonization of Greenland by Erik the Red was not just an undertaking of men. Women, who are often forgotten in history, had a crucial role in the survival of the colony. They were the backbone of Viking society in Greenland, and their work was essential for the life of the community. The women were responsible for childcare, agriculture, livestock, and social organization. They were the guardians of culture and tradition, and their influence was felt in all aspects of the colony's life. The women in Greenland were farmers and ranchers. They worked alongside the men, cultivating the land and caring for the cattle. They were responsible for spinning the wool of the sheep and for making the warm and resistant clothes that protected against the cold. They were the cooks, the nurses, and the educators of the colony. They were the guardians of knowledge and tradition. and their influence was felt in all aspects of the community's life. The women also had an important role in the social organization of the colony. They were the wives of the leaders, and their opinion was respected. The story of Theodhild, the wife of Erik the Red, who converted to Christianity and built the first church in Greenland, is a testament to how women could have an impact on history. Her influence on the religious and cultural life of the colony was incalculable. The role of women in the colonization of Greenland is a reminder that history is not just made by men. Women, with their strength, their resilience, and their ingenuity, were the guardians of culture and tradition, and their influence was crucial for the survival of the colony. The story of the role of women is the story of how collaboration and solidarity can overcome the most difficult challenges, and how their influence can shape the destiny of a people. The story of Erik the Red and the colonization of Greenland came to us through the Icelandic sagas. The saga, which was an epic narrative about the lives of the Vikings, was the main way of preserving the memory and cultural identity of the people. Storytelling was an art, and the storytellers, the skalds, were the guardians of a people's memory. They recited the sagas in banquet halls, in local assemblies, and in hunting camps, and their influence on how history was told and preserved was incalculable. The saga was not just a form of entertainment. It was a way of teaching moral and cultural lessons. The sagas glorified courage, audacity, and honor, and condemned cowardice, betrayal, and dishonor. They were a way of transmitting the tradition and culture from one generation to the next. The story of Erik the Red was used to teach lessons about the importance of leadership, resilience, and audacity. His story was a reminder that life, even with its difficulties, can be an adventure. The preservation of memory through the sagas was crucial for the cultural identity of the Viking people. The Greenland colony, which was isolated and dependent on trade with Europe, was vulnerable to losing its identity. The sagas, which were recited and retold, were a way of maintaining the connection with Iceland and Norway. They were a way of keeping the memory of the ancestors and maintaining cultural identity. The power of narrative is a reminder that history is not just a set of facts. History is a narrative, a story that is told and retold, and its influence is felt in all aspects of life. The story of Erik the Red is the story of how a narrative can shape the memory of a people. The story of the sagas is the story of how the memory of a people can become the basis of its cultural identity. The final years of the Viking colony in Greenland were a period of weakening and decline. The legacy of Erik the Red, which had been the driving force of the colony for centuries, began to fade. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 13th century, made life in Greenland more difficult. Agriculture and livestock, which were the basis of the economy, were affected. The sea ice increased, which made navigation more dangerous and trade with Europe more difficult. The lifeline of the colony, trade, began to weaken, and the colony began to suffer from a shortage of essential goods like iron and wood. The influence of Erik the Red began to fade. His memory, which had been preserved by the sagas, became a legend. The people of Greenland, who had been a people of explorers and pioneers, became a people of survivors. Their culture began to mix with the culture of the Inuit, the new indigenous peoples who arrived in Greenland in the 13th century. The lack of contact with Europe caused the settlers to lose their cultural identity and their connection with the homeland. The final years of the Viking colony in Greenland were a period of isolation and despair. The sagas and historical documents give indications that the last ships to Greenland were sent in the 15th century, and the colony began to decline. The population decreased, and the farms and churches were abandoned. Archaeology, which is the main source of information about the last years of the colony, reveals that the Greenland Vikings, in their last years, adapted to climate change. They became more dependent on hunting seals and other marine animals. The last gasp of the Viking community in Greenland is a reminder that history is not eternal. The colony, which had been a symbol of the resilience and ingenuity of a people, simply disappeared. Its story is the story of how climate change, isolation, and the lack of contact with the outside world can have an impact on the fate of a people. The story of the last gasp is the story of how a great civilization can simply disappear, leaving behind only ruins and mysteries. The story of Erik the Red is a mix of legend and reality. The Icelandic sagas, which are the main source of information about his life and the colonization of Greenland, are epic narratives that mix historical facts, legends, myths, and oral traditions. The archaeological evidence, which is the main source of information about the lives of the settlers, is what allows us to distinguish legend from reality. The differences between the accounts in the sagas and the archaeological evidence about Erik's life and the colonization of Greenland are fascinating. The sagas, with their poetic language and grandiose tone, transformed an explorer into a hero and a colonization into an epic. They describe the lives of the settlers in vivid detail, the struggle against the cold and scarcity, the importance of trade, and the arrival of Christianity. The sagas, however, are also a source of mystery. They do not provide precise information about dates, place names, and navigation routes. The lack of archaeological evidence for some of the events described in the sagas, such as Thorvald's death in North America, raises doubts about their historical accuracy. The archaeological evidence, which is the main source of information about the lives of the settlers, reveals that life in Greenland was much more difficult than what the sagas describe. Archaeology shows that agriculture and livestock were difficult, and that the settlers were more dependent on hunting seals and other marine animals. Archaeology also reveals that Viking settlements and Inuit settlements existed in Greenland at the same time, but that the lack of evidence of interaction suggests that the two peoples maintained a distance from each other. The legend and the reality of the story of Erik the Red are a reminder that history is not just a set of facts. History is a narrative, a story that is told and retold, and its influence is felt in all aspects of life. The story of Erik the Red is the story of how a narrative can shape the memory of a people. The story of the sagas and archaeological evidence is the story of how legend and reality can complement each other to create a more complete understanding of history. The story of Erik the Red and the colonization of Greenland, which was a mystery for centuries, was reborn with modern archaeological excavations in Greenland. Archaeologists, who used cutting-edge technology to explore the ruins of the Viking settlements, revealed details about the lives of the settlers that the sagas could not provide. The Renaissance of Greenland's history is a testament to how science and technology can help us understand the past and fill in the gaps of history. The archaeological excavations revealed details about Viking architecture in Greenland, about agriculture and livestock, about hunting and fishing, and about trade with Europe. Archaeologists found ruins of turf houses, churches, barns, and stables. They found iron tools, weapons, coins, and jewelry. They found bones of animals and fish which help us understand the diet of the settlers. They found artifacts that help us understand the culture and religion of the settlers. The Renaissance of Greenland's history is a testament to how archaeology can help us understand the past. The archaeological excavations revealed that life in Greenland was much more difficult than what the sagas describe. Archaeology revealed that the colony was dependent on trade with Europe, and that the lack of contact with the outside world was one of the main reasons for its disappearance. The Renaissance of Greenland's history is a reminder that history is not just a set of facts. History is a narrative that is told and retold, and its influence is felt in all aspects of life. The story of the Renaissance is the story of how archaeology can help us understand the past and fill in the gaps of history. The colonization of Greenland by Erik the Red was more than a simple migration. It was an event with a lasting political and economic legacy. The colony became a base for Norwegian expansion in the North Atlantic, a strategic point for trade and exploration. Norway, which controlled the trade route with Greenland, became the main power in the North Atlantic, and the walrus ivory and polar bear skins that were exported to Europe became an important source of income for the kingdom. The colonization of Greenland became a symbol of Norway's power and audacity, and its influence on the geopolitics of the region was incalculable. The political legacy of the colonization of Greenland was the creation of an autonomous society. Without the influence of a monarch, the colony was organized autonomously, with local assemblies, the things, where the settlers gathered to resolve disputes, make laws, and make important decisions for the community. The Viking society of Greenland was an agrarian republic, where authority was based on strength and reputation, but the law was applied through a system of local assemblies. The economic legacy of the colonization of Greenland was the creation of a trading center in the North Atlantic. The colony, which was deficient in essential goods like iron and wood, became an important trading center for luxury products, such as walrus ivory and polar bear skins. Trade with Iceland and Norway was the lifeline of the colony, and the ships that made the dangerous journey across the North Atlantic were a symbol of its persistence. The history of the colonization of Greenland is the story of how an event, which began as a story of exile and violence, became an event with a lasting political and economic legacy. The story of Erik the Red and the colonization of Greenland is a reminder that history is not just a set of facts. History is a narrative that is told and retold, and its influence is felt in all aspects of life. The story of the political and economic legacy is the story of how a leader's vision can have a lasting impact on the geopolitics of the region.